and stuff?
Mm-hmm. Here we go.
So just kind of give me a cue when it's time to do a welcome. And
Sure.
can you tell how many people are attending?
Yeah, I see participants are starting to join. It looks like around 15, 13 right now. It's still going up steadily.
Okay,
Welcome, everybody.
Yes, this is great. I'll take a quick drink. So. Well, I'm so glad we're doing this. It's a good thing for the area. Should I go ahead and go, or?
Let's give it, sometimes people have connection.
Yes, and especially up here. Yeah.
So let's wait until the clock strikes 7:01 at least.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not even seeing this timer, so. You know.
If you're just joining, we'll get started in just a minute.
Eight.
I'm thinking, Lisa, more people might trickle in, but if you want to go ahead and get started.
Okay, I will. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Kenny. I'm from Sandusky, and I'm working with the Sand Lake County Planning Commission and the municipal planning firm Beckett and Rader of Ann Arbor as the local coordinator for our new Sand Lake County Master Plan. One of the biggest changes to land use in the coming decade is using farmland for alternative energy production with commercial wind and solar installations, and this has meant lots of updates for townships in their master plans and zoning ordinances. To save each township time and some money in updating their plans, as well as advise them on potential problems that could come up if their zoning is not done correctly, we have reached out to Dr. Sarah Mills of the University of Michigan, who has spent her career researching and advising on wind and solar developments and their impacts on rural farming communities. Her education and experience in this field is extensive. Her CV is 10 pages long, so there was a lot there. She will be answering any questions that you can come up with during this presentation specific to zoning in Sand Lake County. She has many resources available that can help you with zoning language, and everyone can access this after the presentation. We'll have it on the county website probably within the week. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter tonight, Dr. Sarah Mills.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you very much all for having me. And thank you folks who have joined in tonight. Just so you know how to participate tonight, if you have a question, like Lisa says, I'll answer as many as we can get to tonight, and both here and beyond. So please feel free to use the Q&A button. You should see it somewhere on your Zoom screen, probably on the bottom. Once you can post questions as they come to you, and there's a couple times throughout the presentation that I'm going to stop and see if there's anything that is directly related to what we just covered, but then we'll reserve an hour or more at the end to take any questions that come in. So please feel free to submit them along the way. To help me with that, I want to introduce to you another Sarah at the University of Michigan, Sarah Lee. You'll hear her voice a little bit throughout too, because she's going to help me keep an eye on the Q&A bar. All right. Lisa, that was a kind introduction, and my resume is way too long. But I am going to go into just a little bit of details, because I think it's helpful to know kind of what my perspective is and what my bias might be, and how I'm able to, I know I'm not there in Sandusky with you there tonight, but how I'm able to zoom in virtually. So I ended up looking at renewable energy really by accident. When I came back to the University of Michigan to get my PhD, I was studying rural land use planning, specifically farmland preservation, and ended up researching wind energy, both in Huron County and kind of up by Cadillac, as a farmland preservation tool to see if people who have wind turbines on their property, if there is a mechanism of helping to preserve their land. That research, plus some additional, I've done surveys of over 4,000 Michiganders who live near wind farms to understand the impacts that it's having on both landowners and their neighbors and the entire community. My research since then has been on renewable energy policy and kind of public opinion associated with renewables. And right now, the thing that's keeping me in the office late tonight, or who's paying for me to be in the office late tonight, is a grant that I have from the State Energy Office, which is within EGLE. That's the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And that grant is, there's a couple of purposes within that grant, but it is to help facilitate planning and zoning so that more communities are proactive on renewables. So this is why I'm really excited that this is happening in the context of your planning conversation. It's also to provide local governments with state-based data about what impacts renewables have in Michigan, and also to talk about pros and cons. And so you'll see that that is one of the things that I'll be doing. So the kind of outline for the next 45 minutes or so is to first talk about why you should plan or replan for renewable energy. Then talk about the community impacts of wind and solar, and this is where that pros and cons conversation happens. Then I'll talk about some basic principles in planning and zoning for clean energy that you should be keeping in mind. And then, as Lisa mentioned, point you to a bunch of resources that some of which I've developed, but most of which I've just tried to pull together from really good resources that Michigan State Extension or others have together. All right, so again, if along the way you've got questions, put them in the Q&A. But otherwise, I'm gonna keep on going. Okay, so first, why plan or replan for renewable energy? A lot of people look at old wind energy maps. This one is done probably in the early 2000s. And sometimes they used to have labels here that was like moderate wind speeds or marginal wind speeds. You can see from the colors, maybe they're not intuitive, that the thumb is one of the windiest onshore places for wind energy, and there are kind of patches throughout the middle of the state that are, not quite as great as they are in Huron and Sanilac counties, but not green here, which means low wind resources. Similarly, a lot of times people look at a map like this, which is showing solar potential, and say like, Michigan, like look at the color here compared to Arizona and New Mexico. And what I often draw people and effectively draw the conclusion that we shouldn't be talking about solar in Michigan. But I draw people over here to the legend, which is showing that this is not a map that goes from 0 to 10. Here in Michigan, we're kind of at a 4 or 4.5 in terms of solar energy potential. Let's call it a 4. Where over in kind of the Southwest, it's over 5.5 or maybe in some parts right along the border with Mexico, close to 6. A statistic that I often use is that a solar panel put on a roof in Michigan produces about 70% of the electricity that that same solar panel that's put on the roof in Phoenix would produce. So we're not talking 0 to 10. It's 7 to 10. Another kind of important reason to plan is that oftentimes people will look across the state, and I mean, in Sanilac County, you're not too far from existing, a lot of existing wind energy, and there's even some wind energy already there, but say that this is really a regional thing. And you can see right now across the state, we do have lots of wind and solar projects. Even if you don't know kind of what a megawatt is, which you don't need to know, just pay attention to kind of the magnitude of these numbers. So right now we have 3,600 megawatts Most of that is in wind energy. But the real reason that it's important to plan or replan is when you look at the maps of what wind and solar developers are thinking about, are contemplating putting onto the grid. So there are some wind projects also in the this is called the Interconnection Queue, the MISO queue, that this is the kind of regional grid operator that developers see, first of all, if there's space onto the grid and what it would cost for them to connect into the grid. And there's 7 wind projects right now under consideration, just under 1,000 megawatts. But the real big difference is looking at solar. So again, in the state right now, we have 400 megawatts of solar. What is being considered is 20,000 megawatts of solar in 120 projects. You can see about 17,000 of them, which are just the yellow dots, are solar only, but there's another almost 3,000 megawatts that are solar plus a battery, which helps, you know, after the sun goes down, helps those electrons get onto the grid. I want to be clear that not all of what is shown on those maps will be built, but lots will be. Earlier this year in Crane's Detroit Business, there was a story that was quoting both Consumers Energy and DTE, looking at how many, how much land they were seeking for solar projects to fulfill what their economic models say should be brought onto the grid. And collectively, it was almost 100,000 acres. So consumers said they were looking for between 40 and 56,000 acres. DTE was slightly less. Although the DTE just recently came out with a new integrated resource plan, which is kind of explaining where they think they're going to get their power from for the next 15 years. And they increase their amount of renewable energy in that plan. It's not just these big projects that are on the rise. This graph is showing small scale solar projects that are effectively at people's houses or on their farms. And you can see the rise. Not all of this is solar, but most of it is. 90%, according to the Public Service Commission, is solar. And you can just see this huge rise over time. And you may be noticing more and more neighbors putting solar on their roof or on the roof of their barn or kind of in their backyard. The reason that there's so much activity in the renewable energy space is for a couple of things. First, there is increased demand from some consumers. Some cities have plans to get more of their power from renewable energy, and a lot of businesses, a lot of corporations too, are asking for more renewables. But there's also changes in the technology, specifically with wind, and cost reductions of solar that are making renewables more possible for statewide. And this is among the reasons that consumers and DTE's long range kind of energy plans are calling for more and more renewables over time. So in terms of the changing wind technology, the big thing that's happened over the course of the last few years is that wind turbines have gotten taller. So this is showing the kind of height of turbines specific to Michigan. So the turbines that are right here, kind of just south of the Mackinac Bridge, are 316 feet tall. Most of what you see in the thumb is around 490 or just close to 500 feet tall. And then there's a project that was built last year, the year before, in Isabella County that has currently the tallest wind turbines in the state. These are 583 feet tall. And as wind turbines get taller, they're able to access more consistent speeds, but also you can see that the kind of circle of wind that they're able to capture is bigger. And so they're just, each machine is able to make a whole lot more energy. It's also making more places across that map that I showed you with kind of average to better than average winds, more places on that map viable for wind power production. In terms of why we're seeing this huge growth of solar energy, both on rooftops and in terms of kind of solar energy facilities, solar power plants, is because of the dramatic decline in the cost of solar panels over time. So you can see that the kind of biggest declines happened in the early 2010s, but even since then, you know, every year has seen some additional declines in price. In terms of why there is additional attention in some parts of the state, in part, it is due to a map that just recently came out from Washington. So there's a federal level policy to try to make sure that communities who are disadvantaged in some way are able to take advantage or are able to benefit from the financial investment from federal infrastructure. Like I said, the White House just recently released this map, and in it, you can see that many of the communities within Sanilac County were classified as what's called a Justice 40 community. Most of these are classified because they have really high energy costs in comparison to household incomes. And so there's a lot of additional activity and eyes on places in the state that are gray on this map. And if you're curious kind of how a community is classified or why, or kind of to look beyond the state, again, when these slides are posted, you can zoom in and kind of play around with the tool. But this is why there's lots and lots of activity in particular places now. And I'm not sure kind of what's all is happening in Sanilac County, but if you're seeing lots of activity, this could be why. So this is my final slide in this section before I go to Q&A to see if there's anything, points of clarification that came up here. And what I would say is all of this suggests that it is really, really important that you are preparing now. And it's really great that you are thinking about this within the context of your plans. Planning for renewables now allows you to set clear expectation for property owners who might want to put rooftop solar on their barn or house, or also potential developers. When the zoning is silent about a land use, it's really ambiguous. Nobody knows kind of what the rules are. And by being clear in your zoning ordinance about how you are thinking about renewable energy and where you think it fits and under what circumstances you think it fits, sends a really clear message to developers about what your rules are and how any energy development that they may be interested in proposing in your community, how it can be done on your community's terms. I would say, and this is again my bias as a planner, that having that discussion, it's best before you actually have a proposal on the table, before there is a wind farm or a solar farm that's fully cooked. It gives you the time to think about what fits best for your township. It allows for there to be fewer conflicts of interest, because once you have board members or planning commissioners who are signing leases, it makes it complicated for them to participate in the process. And really, it gives you the opportunity to strategize and think about what, again, makes the most sense for your township. I want to underscore that the process here is really, really important. I want to, I have some research that finds how people feel about a wind project after it's built. A whole bunch of it is shaped by how they feel about the planning process and whether they feel like their voices were heard by both the developer, but also by the local officials. So the process itself is really important. And I would say that in this space, there's going to be lots of legal scrutiny from all sides, both people who don't want a wind or solar farm there and from people who do. So it's really important that if you're a local official and listening to this, that you are dotting your I's and crossing your T's. And I would also say it is better to err on the side of more notice. Let people know what is happening, what conversations you're having at the planning commission table, on the town board table. Hear their voices early on, so that they can be a part of shaping what it is that how it is that you're going to articulate your township's rules. This is kind of a leftover here. I have said for a while that I think all communities will be approached within 10 years. I think now, honestly, it may be closer to 5 years. And if your township hasn't already been approached by an energy developer, it's really just a matter of time. Especially those of you that were on that previous that previous map where there's gray. There's a lot of attention. And so it's really exciting and important that you're proactive in thinking about this. All right, before I move on to the next part, which is talking about the pros and cons of wind and then solar, I'm going to check and see, Sarah, do we have anything in Q&A that is a point of clarification?
Yes. So one person said it had a comment, and maybe you want to address it, that I think they meant there are now wind turbines currently being built in Huron County and near Saginaw with a height close to 700 feet. Are you aware of that?
So that's not shown on a map yet, so I haven't been able to like verify it, but I have heard that there are wind turbines under discussion, and some developers are proposing projects in Michigan where they're asking the community, would you prefer fewer number of tall turbines or a larger number of, fewer number of 700-foot turbines or a larger number of 500-foot turbines? So I'll keep my eyes out for that. Thank you for that comment.
And then there are two questions, but I think you're going to get at these topics in your next section here on wind energy, one about noise level and another about potential health impacts. Do you want to answer
Sure.
those now or just go to the next session?
I think we'll go to the next part and then we'll come back specifically to this. So, or if I don't answer them along the way, put another question in the Q&A. Okay, so first, like I said, we'll talk about wind energy, and I'm going to spend a little bit less time on it just because first of all, you have more experience in the thumb with wind energy than probably with solar. And also there's just so much more attention right now being paid to solar, but you should, while you're planning, plan for them both. So this is true for both wind and solar, but wind energy technology comes at different scales. So on the left here is something that's probably, what I would consider a small scale turbine, usually up to about 120 feet, but it's really it produces enough electricity for a house or to help supplement kind of on-farm use. So this would be one where it's similar in kind of concept to the solar panels that you would put on your roof. There's not a whole bunch of wind turbines right now between like 150 feet tall, these small ones, and the really tall 500, 600, 700 foot tall turbines that really make up a wind farm, a wind park, a wind energy facility. So there's kind of a gap between these two sizes of technologies, but they're both possible. Most of what I'm going to say now is really thinking about the utility scale, the big scale wind development, because that's often where there are the most questions. A question that often comes up is like, why us? Like, where would a wind developer want to build a wind farm? And as you saw, good wind resource is pretty important. This is why some of, the first wind turbines were in the thumb, or the first big wind developments were in the thumb. So that's an important consideration. But developers are also looking to access to transmission lines. And again, in the thumb, you have the thumb loop transmission line. So there's, so that checks the boxes in a large part of kind of Sanilac County. The other thing that a wind developer is looking to do is avoid endangered species, because they have to comply with all of the environmental regulations, and particularly eagles are things that often kind of foil a wind project. So that's one of the things, is that they're trying to find places where you don't have kind of eagle habitat. They're also, wind projects typically are away from urban areas for a couple of reasons. First of all, there's often not enough open land to site multiple turbines. And because these turbines are so big, they take lots of heavy duty equipment to put them up. And so it's much more cost effective to do multiple turbines at a time. So while it's possible, and we have examples in Michigan of just one or two kind of tall wind turbines, it's much more common, because of the economies of scale of just mobilizing that equipment, to have a wind farm that has 15, 20, 50 wind turbines. So that's one of the reasons that that wind turbines are kept, or wind development is often done away from urban areas. And another is that tall buildings can also alter wind patterns. And so, you know, wind turbines work best when they have free access to the wind that blows. And so they're trying to keep away from things that might change those wind patterns. I'm going to spend a decent amount of time on this slide, but I could tell you that I could talk for days. This is what I did a lot of my research on. So if you have any additional questions on these things, please feel free to put them in the chat. What I'm really going to focus on in terms of wind energy is the local impacts. So the local benefits and local concerns. In terms of the local benefits, you'll see that these tend to be economic. So a lot of my research has been on the people who host wind turbines on their property and what effectively they do with that revenue. So my research finds that people with a wind turbine on their property reinvest that into their farm. They are buying new farm equipment, they're tiling more field or buying additional land, they're buying more equipment. I think I already said equipment. They're building more outbuildings, they're reinvesting it into their home. In effectively all categories, they are taking that money and reinvesting it kind of in their property. What my research has found is that there are also people with wind turbines on their property telling me that they are shoring up their succession plan so they know who's going to take over the farm when they pass. Anecdotally, they've said that they've been able to convince a kid that farming isn't such a risky business because they have this guaranteed revenue coming in every year. While some of the turbines in the thumb were built, I think in 2008, it's not been quite enough time to see like a full generational shift. So in another 10 years or so, we'll be able to know if that farm succession happened. But the fact that they have a plan in place is a pretty good is a pretty good indicator that their farm will go on to continue to be farmed rather than sold for residential development. And the other thing that my research has picked up is that in wind, it's not just the people with turbines on the property who are receiving these landowner payments. That the most common model in Michigan is that also the kind of neighboring landowners, whether you have a couple acres or you have a lot of farmland around, the neighboring landowners are also tend to be compensated. In terms of economic benefits, there's also tax payments that developers make. Wind development is taxed as industrial personal property. And so the highest payment tends to be in year one, and that declines that declines over time. And you may have seen it in the news that just like lots of property tax payments, lots of property tax things, some developers have contested those payments. So that's why I give it a little caveat here, because what the exact number is difficult. It's based on kind of what the assessor and the kind of property owner believe to be the value of that turbine. In many situations, but not all situations, there are also developers have also made donations to local groups, sometimes to community foundations, sometimes directly to kind of local government organization or local government needs. So, but those again kind of vary from project to project. And the other kind of local economic benefit is in jobs, but it might not be in the jobs that you expect. So there's a lot of, most of the jobs are during the construction activities. And like I said, there's specialized equipment that goes into constructing these 500 or 600 foot tall turbines. So many of the jobs during construction are actually in the hospitality industry, hosting kind of out of town workers. Very often developers try to hire local firms to haul aggregate and do some of the excavation, but a lot of the construction itself is done by specialized crews from out of the area. There are some long-term jobs. My research finds that it's about one job for every 10 turbines, give or take. So, in a kind of normal size wind farm, that could be 8 to 10, maybe 15 jobs, but that really is going to vary, and like how big that is, I mean, it kind of depends on, and who's going to take those jobs depends on whether you have local folks that are qualified as wind energy technicians. So those are kind of the local benefits. In terms of the local concerns, one of the common concerns is associated with noise. And I put this together with health because a lot of the research is effectively looking at whether people who are annoyed by wind turbine noise have physiological impacts, so have health impacts associated with that. The research finds not this direct link that wind turbine noise causes people to be sick, but instead the annoyance from the noise causes sickness. That's where there's the most active research. What's really hard about that is that different people suffer different levels of annoyance. So there's been some research finding that some people hear the very same, who are exposed to the very same amount of noise. One person can be really annoyed and the other person not. But it's that annoyance and the stress induced by that, and particularly if it's an unwelcome noise that you didn't want. That's where a lot of the health research is associated with noise. There's often also concerns about wildlife. So wind turbines may well kill birds or bats. Actually, that's one of the a common concern. There's how many birds or bats are killed really depends on where those wind turbines are sited. There's more bird and bat activities in different places. And so effectively, farmland tends to be a better, more or a less impactful place. There tends to be less bat activity than wind turbines that are sited kind of in the woods or kind of mountain areas where there's more bat habitat. But there's often wildlife impacted, there will be some birds or bats killed. But what the extent of that is, like I said, it varies. In terms of the local concerns, I think that visual impacts are some of the ones that are often most important to people. So clearly, you're not going to hide a 500, 600, 7-foot tall, 100-foot tall wind turbine. And the impact is not just during the day. At night, you in Sanilac County may well be aware that there is the Federal Aviation Administration requires red lights on the top of a turbine. And that red light you can see from a lot farther than the kind of neutral colored wind turbine during the day. There's a technology that your zoning ordinance could require that would force the developer to apply to the FAA for a technology that sets up radar on the perimeter of the wind farm that turns those lights off except when an aircraft comes in the vicinity. But that's not widely deployed right now in Michigan. And the FAA could say, no, it doesn't work in this place. You have to have the red lights. So that's a kind of an outright impact of the visual impact of wind turbines. There's another thing that's often brought into this conversation though, and that is what impact will having these tall turbines have on my property values? As a planning commissioner, I know that often comes up when something is proposed nearby. The published research right now in the US finds that there's not an impact of wind turbines on nearby property values. Some of the research from Europe and Canada suggests that there is, but it's different impacts. Some of this, actually the most interesting research in my mind, comes from Canada, where in places that say they did not want wind turbines, there is a higher property value decline than in places that did not say they did not want wind turbines. There, it's a provincial or effectively the state level decision. And so the only thing that local governments can do is protest, say, we are not willing hosts. And in those communities that say they're not a willing host, that's where they see some property value impacts. My research is really a lot on this last point here, which is that some communities, there are patterns in which communities say that they are unwilling hosts, and those communities that say they are unwilling, or they are, let me say that again. there are patterns in which communities say they are willing hosts, they want wind turbines, and those that say they don't want wind turbines. And a lot of it has to do with why it is that people live in that place. So some of my research done with Doug Bassett at Michigan State finds that in places that are really focused on agricultural activity, where people are living there for the productive value of predominantly for the productive value of their land, wind energy is another way to make money off of your acreage. And so wind tends to be less controversial. In places where there are a lot of people there for the views, this is where they have vacation homes or second homes, or they retired to get out to the country, and they're not necessarily there for the quality of that land itself, wind is much more controversial. The name of our paper is Farmers versus Lakers, because we see kind of that there's these different types of reactions to wind energy. And most often the concerns that tend to be voiced about wind energy are from people who are effectively say, I moved here for the view, and this is not, a wind turbine is not compatible with why I moved here. In terms of helping people think through how, especially large wind development fits within their planning, I would suggest, and a lot of the research would suggest, that a wind energy development is an economic development proposition for a community. And it's one that may not fit in all communities. If your community's goal is to sustain agricultural activity, wind can fit. It has a relatively small footprint in terms of taking land out of production, but it provides farmers with some guaranteed income that can be reinvested into the property. If your goal is for substantial residential development or growth of tourism, something that is really tied to that landscape, wind might not be right, because while there may be some wind tourism, there are also people who this is not in keeping with what they imagine that landscape to be, and that would deter them from kind of building a new house maybe, or spending money on a vacation home in that community. And so I would suggest that as you're thinking through the planning, you're thinking through how wind is compatible with what your long-term economic goals are. I'm going to pause there to drink, and then ask Sarah Lee if there are any questions about wind before I move on to solar.
All right. Yes. I have a couple questions. I'm going to go back to that earlier question that came in on noise level. Do you know what the projected decibel level of the tallest windmills are, and the distance that they can be heard?
I do not. I do not. What I know is that it varies from kind of turbine to turbine model, but it can also vary according to the kind of topography. So kind of how wind sound is heard is different in hilly areas versus flat areas. It's different in terms of whether there's kind of woods around. So that's not something that I know, and that I think that there would be a super straightforward answer to. But overall, sound does dissipate with distance.
There's a question on health, and you kind of answered this already, so maybe it's just reiterating a similar answer, but have there been health studies done on windmills as it relates to building close to residents? It sounds like what you were saying before, it's more the annoyance factor, but
that's where a lot of the research is now, because a lot of the early work was like, what are the health impacts of people that are living nearby? And is there something about like the kind of sound, or something about the some other quality of a wind turbine that may be leading to health outcomes? I would say one of the very last slides that I'll have is showing some guidance from MSU Extension on zoning for wind. And there's also, like, the first half of the report is all about kind of pros and cons, and they have a whole bunch of health studies that are linked to in there that you can get more information about, specifically kind of health research, which is effectively finds not a direct link.
Okay, thank you. There's some questions on setbacks, but I think you're going to cover that in the zoning portion later. Do you want to hold off on those? Okay, we'll come back. Tax
Although
rate,
I'm just gonna say, I'll say to the question about the setbacks, there is no right or wrong setback. Or like, what should it be? Like, there's lots of different ways to discuss that, and what I would say is being consistent. So I'm gonna foreshadow that by saying I'm not gonna give you a single number. Because it's different from place to place, based on what your goals are and what you're trying to protect.
thank you. Tax rates, if you want to talk about that, how are tax rates derived? Is there a set formula? So the communities are not experiencing what Unionville, is it sibling area schools are facing with the Consumers Energy attempt to recover 1.2 million in disputed tax revenues levied on turbines?
That's a great question. So right now the dispute that's resolved, so the property taxation for wind, like I said before, it's an industrial personal property tax, and there is a multiplier table. So effectively, you see when you put in like when the turbine was built to determine where you are on that multiplier table. I call it a depreciation schedule. It's like how it goes down over time. So it's kind of based on the year that the asset was built. What's disputed in the part that was in the newspaper, I think it was just today that was in MLive, is over what value should be placed in there. So it's not the table, like people are using the right multiplier table. It's like, what is the value? There's also, if you want, I believe, and this is where like I know enough to be dangerous. So like any tax assessors can totally put in additional chats. There is the kind of table format, but assessors are also given some discretion and latitude to assess according to their normal principles. So I think that that's where this kind of dispute arises, is like, what is it worth today? And some of that's about like what goes into total new cost, but also like using an alternate approach.
Thank you. A question about property value loss. You touched on that a little bit. I don't know if the person that asked that question has a more specific question. If you want to put that in the chat, or excuse me, the Q&A function, we can get to that, but you touched on that a little bit.
And both the property values and the health research, again, I'm going to point you to the MSU wind guidance. And actually, Sarah, while I'm talking, maybe you can dig that out. It's the 2020 guidance. And if you can't find the link, I'm happy to find that too. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about solar. And again, we can come back to any questions that you have about wind. Keep on putting them in the Q&A. Okay, but this is, I'm gonna dwell on this just a little bit longer because this is where a whole lot of activity is. Solar is also really tricky because while I showed you kind of two different pictures of scales or sizes of wind turbines, solar is infinitely scalable and can come in lots and lots of different permutations. So there can be roof-mounted solar arrays on a garage or on your house that are really sized to help offset the needs of that residence. This is a similar sized array, but it's ground mounted rather than roof mounted. So you can imagine this in somebody's backyard or side yard. Solar can also, a whole bunch of these solar arrays can be strung together into a solar farm, solar energy production facility, solar power plant. This one, I think that this is the picture of, it's mounted on these ballasted posts. So that means that it's probably on a CAF landfill. And I think this is the one in East Lansing. And if I'm right, and it is the one in East Lansing, it's a couple acres in size, or this is the picture from the Lapeer solar facility, which is 250 acres or so in size. So lots of what appears to our eyes to be the same technology, lots of permutations, how it's mounted, where it's mounted. The other thing that is really tricky about solar as I mentioned before, like not just the number of projects has been changing very rapidly, the scale of a solar power plant has been changing rapidly. So in this column, this is showing kind of the average size or kind of the stats for the existing, what I would call, again, solar power plants. We're taking out, there's no rooftop solar in this. This is just a solar power plant. And on average, they are 11 megawatts, which works out to about 55 to 88 acres. You can see there, I use 5 to 8 acres each. The largest solar farm right now in the state is in Shiawassee County. It's actually kind of 3 projects put together, but it all operates more or less under the same name. It's called the Assembly Solar Project. And that project is 239 megawatts. It's spread over 1,900 acres. And so in terms of that, kind of the multiplier, acres to megawatts, for this project, it's 7.9 acres per megawatt. So that's where why I kind of use those numbers. So this is the biggest project that's coming, and that's the biggest project that is currently here, and that's much closer to the average project that is proposed. So the projects that are on that earlier map that I showed, kind of all over the state, they are on average 160 megawatts. So between 800 and 1,300 acres. So more than a square mile, more than a section. In some situations, more than 2 square miles. The biggest project, and this is again is a little bit harder to know. Maybe it's possible that there are bigger projects, but that have just been put in put in as individuals, like kind of they've been broken into parts. But a biggest single connection into the grid here is 500 megawatts. So that's 2,500 to 4,000 acres. In terms of what a solar developer is looking for, the solar resource across the state is not that different. The map looks largely the same in all parts of the state. What they're really looking for is access to a substation. They really need, especially for those largest projects, they are looking to go onto the transmission lines. So those are the big towers that you see running long distances. How close they want to be to a substation or to a transmission line really depends on the project size. So for small projects that are under 50 acres, you want to be either adjacent to a substation, or that size of project can go on to the distribution wires. So that's the lines that supply our houses. But projects that are bigger than that really are going to go on to the transmission grid. And for that, they don't want to be more than a couple miles from a transmission line. And again, what they're really looking for is where there's already a connection into that transmission line where there's already a substation. And so those are the most preferable places. Solar developers are looking for land that is cleared, so they don't have to take out a bunch of trees, and that's flat. Again, it makes it easier kind of to organize put up their panels, which means that farmland is one of the key places that they're looking. I should say that brownfields and even kind of parking lots are also possible, but there are limitations on using brownfields or parking lots. Some of them are kind of logistical limitations. They also tend to be smaller in size, and so you just can't achieve the economies of scale. But there's also kind of concerns over, well, who's responsible for contamination and that kind of thing. So it's possible, and we do have some solar projects that are on brownfields or capped landfills, but it's a lot of things are easier on farmland, and so that's among the reasons that's a sought after site. In terms of, I'm going to go very quickly kind of over, I'll talk about this, but then I'm really going to talk about a lot of these things together because there's a lot of questions that I have about solar and farmland preservation. And so we'll get to that in just a little bit. to summarize, in terms of local benefits, there are landowner payments that are made to people who host solar panels on their property. And those landowner payments tend to be more lucrative than wind landowner payments because, generally speaking, you know, you can't farm right up to, you know, you're not farming underneath the solar panels. And so this is like an alternative land use rather than one where you're, you know, part of your farm is wind turbines and you're farming up to it. So it's to compensate the fact that you're not, that land can't be planted or farmed as you have been farming. There are, while it's not as common and solar development is relatively new, there are some, I'm hearing that there's occasionally payments to neighboring landowners who don't have solar panels on their property. Again, how prevalent that is, I don't know. We're actually doing a nationwide, I'm working on a nationwide survey right now to try to understand that, but that's something that's also possible. Similarly, the sense is that solar panels, and the state tax commission says that solar panels will be taxed. It's currently, they suggest that it's to be taxed as industrial personal property. That is, I put a question mark here though, because there's alternative bills that were proposed to replace that industrial personal property tax with a payment in lieu of taxes. It didn't pass in lame duck. And so, but this is something that has been coming up in the state legislature a couple of times now. So I would expect that it may be taken up again. So how much tax revenue there is really difficult to determine right now. But the idea that this is property that would be taxed is something that the state tax commission has guidance on. There's not a set kind of multiplier table. The formula for solar farm taxation is a little bit more complicated and beyond my means ability to ascertain, but this is something that there is guidance for assessors on that. I give the same jabs caveat as for wind development, although a lot of the construction jobs for solar development can and often are held by locals. A lot of it is kind of, you know, work that's, you know, effectively putting the panels together. There's work for electricians associated with this. It's not quite as specialized as wind work is. But the caveat here is that it tends to be during the construction activity and there's not tons of long-term jobs. Actually, there's fewer long-term jobs kind of on a per megawatt basis for solar than there is for wind, in part because there's not as many moving pieces. So there's less to keep maintained for solar project than there is for wind project. There's also a potential to improve water quality or to create kind of more pollinator benefits, ecosystem kind of benefits. And a lot of that depends on kind of what is planted underneath the solar panels and around the solar panels. So those are the potential local benefits that could come with a solar farm. The concerns are, I'm going to just buzz over them because I think a lot of them have to do with what people are thinking about for farmland. So one is associated with wildlife. And I would say that most of the impacts are during construction. It's a construction activity. It's going to scare critters away. So long as they have someplace to go during construction, they can come back to the solar farm. And in fact, there's less activity usually on that plot of land once the solar farm is constructed because you don't have tractors going through quite as often. It's difficult for deer, like deer are not going to get in. Well, you don't want deer to get into the solar farm. There's a problem if deer get into the solar farm. But smaller critters, you can often have wildlife fence that allows for them to come in. And so, and again, kind of depending on what is planted in and around the panels, they can offer kind of a refuge. A big impact, again, another common concern is a visual impact. Certainly, like if we're just looking at it from afar, the visual impact of a solar farm is not the same as a wind turbine. However, when we're talking about a couple square miles of solar panels, and again, it's not going to be full sections probably, but kind of strung out throughout a community, that certainly has impacts on on those people that are driving by, and if you have a house that is surrounded potentially on, you know, all three sides, maybe even across the street with a solar project. And so a lot of that similarly gets to this, it's not why I moved here idea. And then finally, this is where I will go to my other slides, which is a lot of the concerns are whether or not this is a wise use of land, particularly if we're talking about farmland. So again, I'm gonna dwell on this for a little bit just because what my degree is actually in is farmland preservation. And so I think this is a really interesting topic, and one that I got to tell you, we're still grappling with. So just a couple weeks apart from each other, there were these two stories that ran in the Washington Post. One talking about solar developments drawing opposition over about loss of farmland, and another talking about solar as the next money crop for farmers. And so the question that I think about is solar a new threat or a new opportunity to farming? And I would suggest that it really depends on what it is that you mean by farmland preservation and what you're trying to preserve. And I would bet that farmland preservation is a goal in most of your townships, but I would also bet that different people mean different things by it. So often planners think about farmland preservation as preserving an urban boundary. So keeping people who need city services in the cities or in the villages, and preserving rural lands for low density activities that don't require those urban services. Typically you do this because you don't want to have to extend water or sewer infrastructure out into rural areas. And a lot of the residential development that happens comes with a cost. And so the sense here in terms of this urban boundary is that solar is a land use that's not allowing you to actually build a house on that property because it's occupied by the solar panels for at least 20 years. So it's forestalling that that residential development. It's contributing to local property tax revenues without taking a whole bunch of services. So on this one, it tends to be solar works well in terms of preserving an urban boundary. Mentioned this idea of aesthetic impacts and like the visual impacts. And some people, what they mean by farmland preservation is preserving a rural vista. Like they want to keep the landscape like it was when they moved in. Honestly, in the farmland space, this is what gave rise back in the 70s and 80s to right to farm laws, because farmers had a different vision, of what farming was and what they needed to do to stay alive, stay in the farming business than what some of their neighbors did, particularly when it was changing kind of what crops were grown or kind of what methods were used. And so this is one where it does change. It has an impact on the rural vista. If that's what you mean by farmland preservation, like that's something to acknowledge. We talked about habitat before. Some people's idea about why you want to preserve farmland is to preserve habitat. And so it's construction activity, but again, usually some kind of habitat can return. The last two are the ones that I'm most interested in. So the first one is land for growing food. And while I'm involved in a couple of research projects looking at agrivoltaics, this is the idea of stacking energy production and agricultural activity. So doing both with the same piece of property. And it's possible to do that. There are examples of the guidebook that I'll show you in a minute that we worked on with MSU Extension talks about dual use in terms of being able to graze sheep underneath solar panels, or providing pollinator habitat and doing kind of bee honey production, right, is a form of agricultural activity. But it's a little bit different. Like, I'm not gonna lie, it's not sugar beets, it's not corn and soybeans. So it's not everybody's sense of like what it is that we're growing. Again, solar, while the solar panels are there, and as currently practiced, it may be temporarily taking land out of at least the kind of production that we're imagining, but it tends to be more reversible than other forms of development. It really depends though if you see this as a short-term or a long-term land use, and you'll see in a few slides at the end, it really depends on local government ordinances. If you are requiring a solar developer to provide stormwater detention on that site, like you're moving all kinds of topsoil. It's going to be really difficult to reverse that and farm that in the future. If you're requiring berming to kind of hide the solar panels behind a berm, if the way that you're doing that is moving the topsoil, again, yeah, you can go through and like unberm it, but that's going to be trickier to do in the future. So you kind of have to, whether or not this land can go back to farming really depends a lot on local government policies, zoning policies. I am most interested, and I think the place where the jury is really out still is on this final one, which is farm livelihoods. So some people, when they say farmland preservation, are really trying to think about the farmer and making sure a farmer can stay in business. And while here there's signs about farmers against solar farming, this is a farmer who has this solar farm on their property, who has this solar project on their property. It's not, nobody's forced to put a solar project on their property. This is they willingly enter into that. What I'm really interested in is whether the decision of one farmer who, again, they're choosing to do solar on their property because it makes sense for them financially. And maybe it is their retirement, and I do not begrudge them their retirement. What I'm trying to understand, I have a project trying to understand right now, is whether that impacts the viability of the entire agricultural enterprise in their area. The very simple way I say it is like, you're going to be selling incrementally fewer tractors, sending less grain to the grain elevator to process, selling less seed corn. First of all, is there a point at which the implement dealer closes, but also like, what does that do to the neighboring property owners? To understand that, to understand the impact that that may have on a farming community, we have some research underway right now to understand what it is that a person with solar panels on their property is doing with the revenue. So first of all, we're trying to quantify how much land that's in a solar project is leased versus purchased. Again, this lease idea is that the revenues may be reinvested, and that's what we're trying to understand. What are those solar leaseholders doing with the revenues they receive? Do they do what people with wind turbines on their property do, reinvest it into their farm? Or again, are they taking it and retiring outside of the community? Do not begrudge them that, but that's important for the community to know kind of how this tends to operate. And then finally, we're also including in our economic model kind of what the impact of the ag sector is, along with kind of the impact in the taxes that are paid, because there are higher property taxes usually on energy activity on solar infrastructure than there is on ag. So that's one of the things that we're working on finding. This project is underway. I've interviewed some solar leaseholders, and I can tell you that some of them have retired and they're happy in retirement, and they're glad that they were able to, lease to a solar developer rather than to sell to somebody who wanted to build a whole bunch of houses. There are some solar leaseholders that are full-time farmers, and they have solar on the back 40 that was hard to farm anyway. And so they're like, this is the farm diversification strategy that wind is. But fewer people are seeing it. So we're hearing those stories. There's also a decent amount of farmland that's in solar that is actually purchased by a solar developer. So we're hearing all of the stories. I'm still working with an ag economist to take this information and put it into an economic model so that we can start to understand what the community-wide impacts are. So that's work underway, but I'm happy to talk more about that if you're interested. In terms of how the state's farmland preservation program, kind of what their policy is on solar and farmland preservation. The policy for PA 116 that is this is the policy that has been effective as of June of 2019, is that if a landowner has a PA 116 agreement, they're allowed to put that agreement on pause. So they can't claim the tax credits, but they also don't have to pay the penalties. They can effectively pause it, as long as there are a number of conditions that are met. First, they need to maintain the existing drainage or field tile, like the overall quantity of drainage that's happening on that site, so that new wetlands don't get established that would then make it harder in the future to farm. So that's the first one. They also need to plant a cover crop that includes pollinator habitat. And the reason to do that is, first, the cover crop is so that you're making sure that you're maintaining, you're not having a whole bunch of soil runoff. And then the pollinator habitat is to provide some ecosystem service to, the butterflies and bees. And the final thing, there's lots of stipulations in the PA 116, but the one I think that's consequential is that MDARD requires that you post a surety bond with the state and have an end of life remediation plan, like the equipment is all taken away at the end. I think when you put all of this stuff together, the way that MDARD or PA 116 is thinking about solar is that they're trying to protect the long-term farmability of the land, maintaining the drainage, having this decommissioning requirements, but at the same time providing farmers and farming communities with this new income stream for right now. So that's effectively my reading of PA 116. So to sum that all up, and like, what should this mean? How might you be thinking about this when you're thinking about how it fits with your overall community goals? In a rural community, especially one where the economic activity is really agricultural, solar, like wind, is an economic development proposition. And where you have land that is of marginal quality, it's really a no-brainer because it is extremely lucrative way for that farmland owner to diversify their farm income. Where you have an ag-based economy and you've got really good farmland, what I would suggest is being consistent. So in thinking through within your zoning ordinance, what else you allow in your ag district. Because my sense, and again, I'll say it, like, I'm a farmland preservation person, my sense is that a whole lot of communities allow a lot of non-agricultural activity that aren't a wise use of farmland in their agricultural districts. Maybe your township is different, in which case be consistent, like you can carry that forward. But if there are lots of things that you require, thinking about how solar is more or less impactful than a golf course, or then, a whole bunch of low density residential development in terms of farmland preservation perspective. The other thing that I would suggest is where you've got good soils and an ag-based economy, and this is what I talked about just a minute ago, is that you need to think about whether solar is a short-term or a long-term land use. If you want to treat it as a short-term land use that can effectively be farmed again in the future, then you really want policies in place that minimize soil movement or compaction, that effectively minimize vegetative screening, because it seems silly to plant a whole bunch of trees that are going to take some time to mature, and then you're not going to need them and you're going to chop them down so you can farm. So kind of thinking through that. And it's really, really important that you pay good attention to your decommissioning. This is the policies to make sure that the equipment is removed. If you see solar as a long-term land use, alternatively, then you really do want to require screening. If this is something that's going to be there for a while, think about, how you can make sure that it's in keeping with the community and kind of what you're expecting of land uses, how you're expecting them to look. You're also, if there's already stormwater management issues, if you've got a lot of flooding downstream, and you may want to have some retention ponds to hold some of that stormwater so it's not flooding the creeks, this could be an opportunity to do that. Just recognizing, again, that that's not going to be super reversible in the future. And so that if you're thinking this as a long-term land use, that might be an opportunity to solve any kind of stormwater management issues as well. Okay. I did my best to talk quickly and do a lot. Sarah knows this. I could talk for days about solar too. Are there any questions that came in, Sarah, that I haven't answered?
I think you kind of touched, well, you were just talking about screening. There's a question on fences around solar farms. I'm not sure if this is on a specific project or not. But maybe you can talk about, have you seen other farms with 7-foot fences or different types of screening?
Yeah. So most big solar projects have to follow the National Electric Code. So what the National Electric Code requires right now is that the solar farm either have a 6-foot fence with 3 strands of barbed wire at the top, or a 7-foot tall fence. So we'll get to this in just a minute when I talk about the kind of samples. Within the sample ordinance that I did collaboratively with MSU Extension, we talk about fencing, and just that you should be, when you're thinking about the zone, once you get to the zoning stage and think about that, you should know that the National Electric Code exists, so that you're not inadvertently kind of putting a rule in place that you can't comply with both your zoning and the NEC at the same time. All right. I see the question about setbacks for solar farms, and I'm going to give you the same answer as the setbacks for wind, which is like, it depends and being consistent. So actually, let me talk about the core principles for planning and zoning, and then kind of the examples and the places where I would point you to get more of that conversation, and see if there are additional questions. Okay, so that is the kind of, hopefully most of the things, like the questions that you had, we just addressed, like what impact would a wind or solar farm have on my community, positive or negative. And now you can take that information into planning and zoning. The first step in this is plan. So think about it within the context of your, thinking about it within the context of your, either your community's master plan. If you're undertaking a new planning effort, talking about it now is fantastic. Even if you're not doing a full scale like master planning effort, thinking about what your community goals are and how these conflict or can help, particularly with respect to local economic development and land use. That's one of the things that I would encourage you to do. I think the other thing that's really important in this planning phase is, as I just noted, different energy sources and different scales have different impacts. And so it's really important to think about like each of these different renewables. So wind and solar, both of them are probably viable, or are likely viable in Sanilac County. And so thinking about both of them, how they fit, where they fit, at what scale, within your township or city is really important. So very commonly on-site renewables, so the small scale wind turbines or kind of solar panels that are intended to first fill the needs of that house or business. Typically those are not controversial, and very commonly local communities decide like we want to leave it up to a landowner to have autonomy in determining how they want to get their power. So we want, like, for solar panels to power your own house, like that's not controversial. Oftentimes communities want to give more thought to utility scale because there tend to be bigger impacts. And just in the part that I mentioned, like spent much more time, all of the time, really focusing on those. So, but it's important to think about not just energy generally, but each of them individually, because they do have different impacts. The impacts of large scale wind and the impacts of large scale solar are different. Once you consider that within the context of planning, so what are your goals, and does solar facilitate them or not? Does wind facilitate them or not? then it's really, then the next step that you move to is making a zoning that matches your plan. So it's the specifics in terms of what are the setback distances to the questions that were raised really matter for your ability to realize that plan. And sometimes people say, we have people in our community that are all over the place, have very differing opinions on a technology, on wind. And so we'll take the setback distance the people who want it have, and the setback distance the people who don't want it have, and we're going to average them. And generally speaking, averaging satisfies no one. It's really important to go back to what is your plan? Where do you think it's important? What are the features that you are trying to buffer? Usually you would use a setback distance because there's some impact that you believe that that technology has that you're trying to insulate neighboring properties from. And so kind of what is the right setback distance depends on whether you're trying to mitigate for sound or whether you're trying to mitigate for visual impacts. Some of them are more or less effective at that too. And so, but just averaging is probably not going to get you what your goals are. The other thing that I think is really important is that you shouldn't think about this as all or nothing. And what I mean by that is that you have to say solar is allowed in every zoning district or wind is allowed in every zoning district versus it's allowed in no zoning districts. Actually, you have to be really careful and you do not, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I would say that you do not want to zone either of these land uses out. So saying that they're not appropriate in any zoning district is probably not the place that I would encourage you to talk to your township attorney, but that's not the place that I would point you to. But you don't effectively have to say it's allowed everywhere. Like instead, it really should be reasoned through about what are the goals of each of your zoning districts and how, again, does this kind of land use support or conflict with those goals? And I will go to that last bullet, which is, I just said, beware of zoning it out. You don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a free for all, but don't zone it out. I would say that there's evidence though that making it hard is okay. But you are in the best place if you are consistent and well-reasoned in why you think that there is limited opportunity in your place for utility scale solar or for utility scale wind. And so again, in this process is important and talking to your attorney is going to be really important. I am huge on consistency. And so I would say when all else fails or when you need to arbitrate disputes, think about being consistent. So I've talked a lot about this and I think about this a lot in terms of solar and farmland. What else do you allow in a particular zoning district or on prime agricultural land? And how does solar or wind, is it more or less impactful for what the purposes of those districts are? Sometimes, particularly for solar, there's a lot of talk about screening, kind of vegetative screening. What else do you require screening for? Like, and what standards of screening do you have? And how might you carry that over for solar? Or similarly, noise limits. For both technologies, it's common to see a noise threshold, especially when we're talking about the large scale projects, to set a noise threshold. Do you have noise limits for other things in your jurisdiction? If not, does that make sense in this situation? Similarly, so for decommissioning, I think it's super wise to have a plan in place in terms of what infrastructure would need to be removed at the end of the life. But in terms of the mechanism for financial guarantee, a bond or something like that, think about what you require those decommissioning bonds for other things, like how you do that for other kind of land uses or projects. And similarly, performance bonds. If you do have some sort of requirement about establishing vegetation, for example, carrying that through to solar makes sense. If you don't, that's a little bit harder of a case to make about why these rules only apply to solar. In terms of the planning and zoning resources, so there's a bunch of them. early on, I went through and like found all of the, I and a grad student went through and found all of the guidance that we could on wind and separately on solar, and put it together, and then effectively curated it, figured out what resources or what language was in each thing, and then elevated the things that are kind of the must reads. And so when you get these slides, you can follow this link, and actually I can, it's gonna make my computer freak out, but once I'm done talking, I will copy this link and put it in the chat so that you have it. So you can go to Eagle's website and get that. There's also case studies of Michigan projects, kind of the impacts of projects, also like the planning process and kind of best practices within the planning process. There's some frequently asked questions that are available on Eagle's website. This past March, the kind of cover story in MTA's Township Focus magazine was on wind and solar. And so there's I think I probably said a little bit more now than what's in there, but if you want to see it in written form and not so rambling, you can go onto MTA's website and get access that issue. There's also 2 years ago, there was a special issue of Planning and Zoning News that was really, really in depth. It talked about a whole bunch of the case law too, associated with renewable energy development. Planning and Zoning News is now kind of, they've closed up their shop, but I have a whole bunch of back issues. And so if you are interested in kind of that longer form, I'm happy to mail those out to you. These are the resources that I've referenced and I see kind of coming into chat. And so I'll make sure that you have access to this. This is the sample zoning for wind energy systems that MSU did in 2020. And then about a year later, we came out with this joint guidance for solar energy systems. And both of these are similar in that the first half is kind of an overall kind of lay of the landscape. What is the research? There's a lot more research on wind than there is in terms of impacts on solar in this environment. So it's more kind of explaining the parts and pieces of a solar energy facility. But then the second half of both of these documents is a sample zoning ordinance that does not tell you, it does not have a specific setback distance, but it gives you some sense of what you might consider in setting your setback distance. So it's more of a fill in the blank, but it's a good place to start to think about what things you as a local official want to consider as a starting point for regulating wind and solar. 2 more slides. One is that so Eagle also has these community energy management incentive program. It's a grant program. And for the last couple of years, they've opened it up to allow local governments to get grants for updating their master plans and zoning ordinances for renewable energy content. Those grants are, the maximum grant award is $25,000. You can use it to send postcards for the planning process, support for public meetings, but also to hire consultants or if you've got a planner on staff, which it tends to be less likely, to do the drafting of a sample ordinance or of your ordinance for your community, do the master planning for your community to incorporate energy into your master plan. So the grants for 2023 aren't open yet. They're supposed to be open in January. When they do open, this link will take you to that. But you can also email Jessica Crawford at Eagle. This is her email here. And she will put you on the list to alert you when the grant goes live. So I don't know all of the details about kind of eligibility, but I think in the past they've made eligible particularly those places, excuse me, that are listed as kind of environmental justice, and there's lots of those in Sanilac County. And they also prioritize places that haven't received one of these grants recently. So if you haven't looked this up, it should definitely be on your radar. And finally, in addition to any of the questions that you have for the next 35 minutes of me, you can feel free to reach out to me after this to answer questions, to review a draft of your zoning I'm happy to say this is the message that it's sending. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? To give a presentation to your township planning commission or to your township board, if that's helpful, if not everybody can make it, could made it tonight. Or to connect you to MSU Extension or other communities to answer questions that I can't answer. I'm also working right now on developing additional training for 2023, doing some training for legal folks through the Michigan Association of Planning and taking people on bus tours, kind of some more deep dives on the nuts and bolts of planning and zoning, specifically on the zoning. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me. And I've included my information here, but also my colleague, Madeline Kroll, who's our clean energy land use specialist, and she's just on vacation this week. So, but either of us would be able to answer any additional questions. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute so that I can copy in the links and take a drink and then ask Sarah if anything else came in.
Yes, so I think I have included all the links that you mentioned in the chat. I've got the first one was the sample zoning for wind ordinance from 2020. And then I added the land use guidelines for siting wind. And I just wanted to confirm, Sarah, with you that that's the right one. I pulled it from the Eagle site, but in the upper right corner, it says October 2007, but it says revised. That's what's on Eagle.
Okay, it should be the right one, but I'm going there to double check because a quick look at it will let me know. Nope, different one. I'll find it. That's also a good one. That's one of the guidance documents that we include. MSU's got lots of good stuff out there. This is let's see if I do chat. The one that I just chatted, that is the wind guidance, the MSU's wind guidance that has the kind of fill in the blank zoning ordinance. Oh wait, yeah, you have it. Sorry, I looked at Sarah. You're great. You have both of the MSU guidance. So
okay, great. And then I
zoning
chatted
and the
out,
land use guidelines.
Perfect. And then I chatted out the Eagle webpage that has the repository of resources for community energy management. And then I also chatted out the planning and zoning for solar energy systems. So all of that is in chat. Going into questions. So the question about setbacks for solar and wind, we're pointing people to the guidebooks to help with that conversation. I think, is there anything else to add to that? I think we're good.
Nope. And I think that's where I would start. Just to again give you the guidance to don't average, think about what your setbacks are now for other land uses, and think about carrying those forward where this might be more or less impactful. And also particularly for when kind of thinking, what are you trying to achieve through your setback? What is the kind of concern that you have? Is it concern over flicker or about ice that might build up? Are you concerned about a turbine blade breaking, which has happened? Kind of what setback distance you might have could vary based on those. So that's something I would keep in mind. The question about who conducted the research on the effects of noise level and health, all of that would be in the kind of health research would be in the MSU wind guidance. And so there's various researchers. One of the things that I would suggest is don't believe everything that you find on Google through the internet. There's a lot of not great research out there. So MSU went to really great pains to find good, solid research that is kind of undergone the scientific peer review process. And so that's where I would point you to start. Let's see.
Sorry, I was gonna say the question on the webinar chat, everything is in there now, but we can share links with Lisa as well. And related to the next question on recording. This is recorded. We will share recording again with Lisa, and I think all of that information will be put on the county website. Is that what we said? Correct.
Yep.
Okay.
That's what I understood. So thanks, Lisa, again for
Yes.
organizing this.
Yes, it will be.
Great.
It might take a little bit because it has to, we have to have someone from the county do that, but yes,
Yeah.
we'll get it up there for you within a week, I'm sure.
What else we have?
Would you recommend scaling planning efforts at the township level rather than the village level?
That's a really great question. So I would say it might make sense. I mean, it might make sense to band with neighbors in the planning and efforts in terms of just thinking through kind of establishing what are the facts and then thinking through the pros and cons. I think that those will be the same regardless of what your unit of government is. Clearly, once you get to the zoning level, if you know, unless you already have some kind of joint zoning authority, people might have to kind of divide up that way. But honestly, one of the celebrated cases in the country for planning for wind energy is from Gratiot County, where they collaboratively planned across the county. So some places are under county level zoning, but there's other townships that have township level zoning. And they had this conversation together. They then went and kind of adapted their own zoning that matched what the overall plan was. But I think that there's a whole bunch of benefit in talking about this, not just at the township, I mean, not even just at the village level, but I'm excited that you're talking about this as a county, because I think that it does help you, you know, I would say wind and solar resources don't stop at township boundaries or the village boundaries. And so it's really helpful to kind of think through this together. And it's a lot of effort to put this together. And so like that you can band, you know, to do a good planning process. And so banding together makes a whole lot of sense. But Lisa, go ahead and add to that.
Go ahead and add to that.
If you wanted to, I don't know.
No, I'm just kind of trying to put people together here because this is not my expertise by any means, but we want to do anything we can to help the townships from the county level. We also want to make sure that you have access to everything. So I'll be sending an email around to all of the township clerks and supervisors and everybody again with a lot of this information and a copy of the recording as well so that you can follow through.
Great.
Thank you very much, because this was excellent.
I think we still have a couple more, and I think
Okay,
you
good.
sent me some questions ahead of time that people sent to you, so I'm going to actually pull those up too. Sarah, do you
Okay.
have more that came in while I'm
Yes.
pulling those up?
What is your take on the state coming in and mandating renewable energy siting in townships who want to zone it out?
So that's a good question. My take is that this is a conversation that's happening right now. Because a lot of townships are saying no. And yet the utilities are saying this is the thing that makes the most sense in terms of our long-term strategy. And so there's a lot of discussion right now about what role the state ought to play and whether the current situation is tenable or not. My take is that I have been giving up a lot of nights to try to encourage communities like yours to proactively plan and to think through what makes sense for you and put in place reasonable guidance that meets your needs, but that doesn't get you in legal trouble, so that you're not reactionary. Again, I sit on a planning commission, so I know it's that, I don't know people who are asking these questions who are attending kind of where you are. Like, when something is proposed, like there's a lot of scrambling to figure out like, oh, what are our rules? And people have lots of strong feelings. The planning process is supposed to help you sort that out. Like, what do we want to be in the community? And what are the technologies? What's the infrastructure? What's the land uses that are going to get us to our goals? And so it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. I don't actually want to suggest to you that everybody is going to be happy with the decisions that you make, but getting out proactively and thinking about this, I think, is really helpful. And my hope is that like communities being reasonable will maybe not have this be something that the state steps into. But yeah, that's my take.
Thanks. Do you happen to know how many counties or townships are being looked at or have already been approached for projects at this time?
I know nothing. I hope that, like, usually when I'm there in person, people come up to me afterwards and tell me like, oh, this is going on in my township. So I have no idea. Just looking kind of at that MISO-Q map, it seems to me that there are some solar developers that are kind of active in the area, a couple of projects, but I don't know. And the problem, I'll say, with the kind of the map that shows kind of where developers are looking is that there's not streets shown on it. It's all about the electrical infrastructure. So it's the geographic information on that map is like which substation they're proposing to kind of tap into. And that's not really easy to figure out geographically where that is. So long answer to say, I don't know. I'm sorry.
Thanks. I should have read this next question after your previous question, but is it worthwhile looking to states that have state level guidance that have spent years and numerous hearings deciding on sound and setback levels? For example, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, New York.
So I think that there's benefit in looking at other places. A lot of the guidance that we have in the kind of deeper repository includes things from some of these other states. Some of the other states that are listed there do have state level siting. One of the things that's tricky is that, like, what is a reasonable setback distance in the Dakotas, where the land parcels tend to be a whole lot bigger than in Michigan, is that, like, some of it's comparing apples to oranges. What you're really regulating for is like health and sound, then possibly, again, the research though now is about annoyance, and that's hard to predict. So I think that there's things that can be learned, but I think that there's also like what local governments are expected to do, or allowed to do, empowered to do here, is to figure out what it is that you want to be in the future, what it is that you see for your community, what your community goals are, and then to think about each of these land uses and how they match into those goals. In case it wasn't clear, like, I think what started some of my research on wind energy and that carries through is that renewables are one of the biggest economic opportunities that rural communities have seen in a really long time. They also have drawbacks. And I think thinking through where those, like, whether this is an opportunity that fits and gets you the things that you want, and where it can go in your community to take advantage of it, and where some of the drawbacks are going to not conflict with your other goals, is really something that you're empowered to do here. And I think that that's really important to think through. I'd just say every energy source has benefits and drawbacks. And so, you know, there's no one silver bullet, just like there's no one like right on setback distance that I think works every place.
Thank you. And then the last one for now in the Q&A, is community solar viable or allowed in Sanilac County?
So community solar, for folks who don't know it, is a term that means different things to different people. So in its purest sense, it means a solar project where people in the community or people in the kind of utility service territory can effectively buy shares into the solar panels. They can own those solar panels as if they were on their roof. And the benefit of it is that it tends to be cheaper to develop a community solar farm than to do it on everybody's roof. The drawback is it takes land. But sometimes community solar can instead mean that it is it's used as more of a term about the kind of size or the scale of a solar power plant. I'm thinking that this person asking this question might be asking about the first one. So I'll talk specifically about this idea of community solar, where it's like people owning solar panels in a solar farm. And there's nothing stopping the utilities from allowing community solar. It's just they don't have to. And so there have been pilot projects in the past that both of the utilities have used that have enabled community solar, but it's not their kind of default. Because it takes more, I think, takes more to get people signed up and that kind of thing. So that was a long roundabout way to say, I don't think it's disallowed. I think it's allowed, but it is not the common thing that I've seen in I don't think that there's a specific program saying, hey, Sanilac County, sign up for community solar. And often, I haven't followed this bill very recently, but very often in Lansing, there are legislative bills put forward that would force the utilities, or yeah, that's the non-euphemism, force the utilities to allow for community solar, to have community solar projects. That legislation hasn't passed, but that's kind of what that legislation is about. Lisa sent me email earlier with a couple questions from someone that came ahead of time. So I wanted to address those. I'm going to read the email. I have a few questions regarding solar panels. It is rumored that our property will be surrounded on 3 sides by solar fields. My questions are: 1, do you know how this will affect our property value? 2, do you know if there are any health risks? And 3, is there any interference with internet, phone, or television signals? So this is solar property value impacts. There's not been tons of research on solar property value impacts from utility scale properties. The published research that's out right now is a study out of University of Connecticut, but the project, like the data is from Connecticut and Massachusetts. So not exactly Michigan. What that research finds is that there's the biggest difference, or the biggest property value impacts, are in kind of more suburban places, or places where farm fields or woods, kind of wooded areas, are at a premium. That's where they see kind of the biggest impacts. I was at a conference where there's a nationwide survey of solar farm property values that was discussed that found similar results in terms of immediate neighbors having a couple percentage point impact on property values. That's undergoing peer review. I don't know actually what the numbers were. That wasn't presented, but there's not much to point to right now. So can I say there will be no impacts? I cannot. Can I say this is what the impacts would be? I don't have those exact numbers. So because I'm not sure, I mean, I don't know exactly the situation, but my sense is that if it's on farm fields around, my sense is that there's lots of, like, that's not a kind of a unique situation around. So that's the property value impacts. The second one is about, do you know if there are any health risks associated with solar? And not that I am aware of. We had there's a solar panel toxicologist at Michigan State. Her name is Dr. Anik Anktil, and she's done one of the fact sheets for us on, sometimes there's questions about PFAS, the chemical that is all over the news because there's a lot of PFAS contamination throughout the state of Michigan. Sometimes was concern about whether there would be some amount of leaching from a solar panel, and that's not the case. Like, there hasn't been any research, and then that could have health impacts. That's not, effectively, that fact sheet says not likely. So those are the primary, that's the only kind of contamination risks are what I've heard, but haven't seen any evidence, health evidence supporting it. And then the third question is about interference with internet, phone, or television signals. And I have not, I will say, this is not part of your question, but I was on a, this past summer, I took a group of people through Michigan Association of Planning on a tour of wind and solar farm, because if you haven't been, it's really useful to be up close and hear the sounds and, you know, see what's kind of going on in and around a project. There was a question though on that tour about interference with AM radio stations because of the kind of inverters and whether there was, I think, whether there would be impact. So we did a test with the bus that was parked right in the middle of a solar farm, and there was no impact there. So the person who had lots of questions about radio, like impacts on the AM dial of the radio, was like satisfied. That was the first time I'd ever gotten that question though. I have not heard that there's anything within a solar farm that interferes with any of those other types of kind of transmission, internet, phone, or television.
Lisa had a question too that was brought up earlier. If a township has landowners who could profit from solar or wind developments on their planning commissions, should those people be allowed to be a part of the planning process? This has happened in several townships.
This is one where I would encourage those places to consider what their kind of policies are. Usually there is a policy in place about what constitutes a conflict of interest when either a volunteer planning commissioner, appointed planning commissioner, or a township board member needs to recuse themselves. Most of that is, and particularly when you're talking about like the zoning, the legislative decisions. And so not as an attorney and knowing that there are different bylaws in different places, I would say, first, check what your bylaws are. Second, if it's not clear, you don't have bylaws, check with your attorney. The final thing that I would say though, is to consider kind of, even if not technically against the rules, thinking about kind of how this looks. Impressions matter. And I would say, going back to something I put on an earlier slide, like the planning process and how people feel about the planning process is important, not just when you're talking about a project proposal or a zoning decision, but if there is a project that ends up getting built, it will have ramifications long down the road. This is some of the research that we have. And like whether people feel like the planning process was fair and that people acted transparently. So being really open is really important. And again, there's a lot of interest in energy on both sides. People who want to have a wind or solar project in your community and people who don't want to have it. There's going to be lots and lots of scrutiny. And so it would be really wise to kind of think about, like, to be really transparent. That's my non-legal advice for you.
All right.
I have lulled you all to sleep.
I am not
Sorry.
seeing any new questions or any open questions on the Q&A.
All right, and I am going to, one final time, again, the slides you can have, the recording will be out and available. Here is my email to contact me, and my colleague Madeline, when she comes back, there's her email. Please feel free to reach out. I really want to help empower communities to do things that are in their interest. So please, there are no questions that are too silly or you're not bothering me at all. So please feel free. Good luck in this. I know that sometimes this is a conversation that's hard to have because people have really strong opinions. And honestly, kicking the can down the road is not going to make their opinions any less strong. Kind of getting public engagement early in this, so you know kind of where people are and can figure out ways, hopefully, to at least address some of those concerns. And so people don't feel like they are not being heard is really beneficial. And so I don't say that it's going to be easy, but I would say that like it will be beneficial. So thank you for the service that you're doing in your communities and for all of your work.
I would just like to thank you, Dr. Mills and Sarah, for doing this. This is wonderful information, and I think it's really going to help all of our townships, and apparently cities might be even approached. It said in one of the early things that just about everybody's going to be approached in the next few years. So I really appreciate that and your offer of all the help. We will make sure that the Sand Lake County News and the Sandusky Tribune Recorder Leader will also have all the links and information within the next week. So I appreciate it, and thank you so much for everything.
Thank you for organizing this too.
Yep.
Thanks for
Have
having
a
us.
good night, everybody.
Bye.